In this lesson, I want to talk to you about repositories and repository pattern, whether to use it or not, and how to use it. First, I will show you an example, and then I will explain why I am not advising to use repositories personally, but that's a personal preference. If you think you can use it, then please do. But first, let's start with an example. Here I have a product list, simple CRUD-based page. Product has name and price, and it's a simple resourceful controller. And here I will have two ways of querying the things. So repository is a class that sits on top of Eloquent to help filter the data. So instead of doing Eloquent product all, you would do product repository all, which seems even longer to write, longer code, but then in the repository you can make all the potential filters, additional querying, additional order by, something like that, instead of doing that directly in Eloquent. So repositories have two purposes, basically, two ways of reasoning why to use them. First is if you want to replace Eloquent with whatever else data layer. From what I've been reading on forums, Laracast, Stack Overflow today, just to recap what people think about it, and the most common reason is to replace Eloquent with whatever else data layer. But the problem is that I haven't really seen that in action. If you do need to replace Eloquent ORM with any other ORM, or even database layer with some other layer like NoSQL, caching, array, JSON, whatever, you will have much bigger problems and much bigger refactoring to do than just replace repository. So that argument, in my opinion, is pretty theoretical, and I really like to do things practical, so what you can actually use. But anyway, another reasoning to do repositories is to make your Eloquent models cleaner. So the Eloquent model would just have the fields, the settings, so for example fillables, dates, relationship functions, and nothing else. And repository would have whatever else you need. So this is the syntax. Repository is just a class. I've created it in app repositories. This is the class that basically mimics the same methods that Eloquent does. So all create, find, destroy, and update, and it references the model as a parameter. And also it implements the interface. So first the interface, we need to specify what methods do we actually need for that repository. And we need basically everything to filter the data, and then we implement that interface in the repository itself. And this is where you would filter the repository. For example, instead of doing all, you would do order by something created at descending and then get. So this would mean that everything that is done with products list in all would be always ordered by created at descending. So this is the layer and the reason why to have repository, to have more methods, even more. You can create more methods, like it's pretty popular to do public function select by something, by name for example, and then name, and then implement that method in the repository and then do select by name. Personally, I'm not a big fan of that because Eloquent should do that. Basically, in controller, there's nothing wrong to have product all or product order by here in the controller. Controller doesn't get ugly from that. It does get ugly from bigger queries, but not from filtering like that. Product order by get. Get should be the correct one. Also, Eloquent has a lot of features that are not used enough. So things like scopes, things like a lot more filtering. You can do a lot of things with Eloquent specifically, and partly Eloquent is the reason why people choose Laravel as a framework, because it's great ORM, Eloquent, and it's really convenient and easy to use with a lot of features. So why would you replace Eloquent with some kind of repository to just have control of over your methods? And also another drawback that I don't understand is then people need to understand how that repository works. So imagine a new developer coming to a team and sees this. Okay, I don't know what product repository is. I need to take a look at here and probably even interface here. Instead of actually knowing the Eloquent syntax, so this is readable because I know Eloquent, this is not readable because I don't know what that repository does. So as you can probably hear, I'm not a fan of repositories, and I'm yet to see a good example of them. For those people who want to use repositories in case they change that data layer to something else, please find a working example of a person who actually changed that data layer with repositories easily. I haven't found it in my research online. Another kind of method and another argument why repositories is you can do a bigger filter here. So for example, instead of doing all, probably you can do this model where something, group by something, order by something. So instead of all, actually in addition to all, probably should be filtered something, right? And then you can do more than one query here, some logic, put some more logic here. So instead of doing that in Eloquent, so instead of doing static method on a model, which is kind of wrong, and instead of doing that in the controller, repository is the thing. But I disagree even with that, because for more complex filtering, more complex operations, you should have separate classes for the logic. And I usually call them services, and we will talk about services in the next lessons. So instead of repository, which actually it even adds a lot of code, so you have to have interface, you have to have repository, you have to implement all the methods. It's pretty cumbersome. So instead of that, you should do app services, for example, product service, and use Eloquent everywhere in the controller, and exactly in the place that you need some more logic, then you call a service. So instead of product all, you create product service, give me something by some query. So that I would be more a fan of that. So my overall thinking about this is repositories could be pretty much always replaced with something else, either with Eloquent structure, Eloquent settings, Eloquent functions and properties, or with a service, or with another layer, or with a job, for example, if you want to create, for example, if store method has a lot of logic, so for example, you need to store the product, then email some notification, then update something else in database, then check something beforehand, so like 10 or 20 lines of code. You shouldn't store that in the repository. You should have a service of product service, store the record, something like that. And it's pretty common to mix those together. Product repository versus service, it seems like the same thing. It seems like the same class with some methods. And the difference between repository that is tied to a particular model, in this case Eloquent model. Class, service is a class that does with anything you want, anything you pass. It's not strict, so service basically is just a PHP class. Repository is really tied with interface, with Eloquent model, and it's kind of another layer on top of Eloquent, which I personally disapprove, but here is the structure, here is the syntax, how you can use it. If you want to, please do so. But before that, please find opinions online, find more working examples online, and there are a few articles on Medium, on Stack Overflow, and people are pretty skeptical even there. But if you still want to use repositories, feel free. This lesson is probably the most important in this course, so if you missed any other lesson, please don't miss this one, as it will answer the ultimate question: where do I put my code, and where do I put my stuff, and how to structure a Laravel project. The most common question from developers is where to put the custom logic. So for example, in the controller, you cannot just call Eloquent model because it involves more logic to get the data. Or similar thing, if you want to create the data, it's not enough to just call Eloquent function create, there's more logic to that. So where to put that custom logic? The most typical example is to create a separate class, and usually it is called a service. It can be called differently. It can be called library. It can be called class, whatever you prefer. But the most typical scenario is a service. And what is a service? Service is basically any PHP class. That's it. There's nothing more complicated to that. You just put some logic in that service. You put the input data, you get the output, and then do whatever you want with that data. Let's take a look at the example. I have a project about basketball games. Let's say we have a list of teams. It's NBA teams, and there is a table, standings table it's called, so which team has the most points, and it's ordered in certain order. So how do you populate that table in the code? So for example, you have a controller for games controller, and you need to have a table controller. And this is a perfect example for services. In my opinion, the best example for service is some kind of calculation which does not belong to Eloquent model, because Eloquent model should have only settings for the model. So fields which are fillable, dates, casts, relationships, and really it's mostly configuration about the model. But custom logic, it doesn't belong to controller either, because controller should be as small as possible. So this is where you can create a service, and that's what I've done here in my example. Just class game service, I've put it in app services folder, namespaced, and I can put whatever functions here. So get standings table is a function where I just populate all the table. I have an array of teams with 0 points at first, but then I do for each loop through the games and add points to games won, lost, and points, and then sort the array and then return the teams. So this is pretty complicated logic, which, as I'm repeating myself already, but it's really important. It doesn't belong to Eloquent, but it doesn't belong to controller either. So that's where service is a perfect example. And how to use the service is just Laravel has some magic to resolve the service. You just need to put the service class name here, put it in use, and you get the variable which you can use already. It's probably the same as you would do new game service, like this. So instead of doing that, you just use that in the parameter of index method, and then you can use it. It's actually wrong controller I'm showing here. Table controller, it's here, but it's the same logic. I have two examples for you. So first example is get standing table. It's just calling the same logic, and that service use Eloquent models. In this case, two models, team and game. Or you can pass it as parameter. You can do things like teams here and more logic. But the goal is to have the controller as small as possible and put every logic into the service. Another example, here in the list of games, let's say I want to schedule next game. So schedule next game is another method of the same service, and service is related to games. So that's why it's called game service. So whatever happens with games should be put in the service. So schedule next game, random teams, creating a game and returning to the controller, and that's it. So next game is here, and you can view it in the blade file. So here, next game starts here. If you go to games, this is our next game. It has been created automatically randomly in the database, and it is returned as a result for the next game. And basically that's it. That's probably the most important thing that you need to know in this course. Overall, is whatever custom logic should be in a separate layer, which is usually a service. Now, service can be substituted with jobs. For example, if it is a job to do something, service, in my opinion, what is the difference? Service is usually for taking the data, for formatting the data, for doing something with the data. So it's usually getting the result, getting the data. Job is to do something, to insert something, to update something, to send notification, to perform something with the data. So it's more about inserting, but that's my opinion. That's my definition in my head. In general, you can do anything with a service, including inserting data. So for example, instead of creating a game, you can call game service create and do all the logic there. So for example, if you want to create a game, then add some points to some team, have some more logic, you can do that in a service or in a job. In that case, those two are pretty similar and pretty interchangeable. I guess that's it. There's nothing more to say. So create services, use them in a controller, and then your controller will be smaller. And we will have more examples of that in our practice section of this course. But for now, that's it. These are services, and I encourage you to use them. In this lesson, we will talk about traits and how to use them. Traits is a structure in kind of object-oriented programming, but it's not object-oriented. It's kind of an include function, include class, a set of functions that you could include as a trait into any object, into any class. And this is usually used when you want to have one function or several functions applicable to a few classes. In most cases, to a few models, to Eloquent models. In this example, I will show you, for example, if you want to add a product and you want to have media upload or photo upload related to that. Then in the code, in the controller, you should probably want to have something like product upload file something logic. But then you want to have a file uploaded also for other models like users. So what do you do then? Then you probably need to create some kind of a photo object, photo class, and then use it for both models, product and user. But the problem with that and why trait appeared in PHP, then in PHP you cannot extend more than one class, so you cannot do comma something else. So how to inject some class without extending it? Because product extends model and user extends model. So this is where traits come in. So you just create a class, app, traits, and I called it photoable. So class, any Eloquent model could be photoable. And I just add upload file function. And for now, for simplicity, instead of uploading, we will just log that information to the log. And then in the model, you just use app traits photoable, use photoable here, and that's it. And then your model could be using that function. So in the controller, you just do the same upload file, call that upload file as if it was a function of that model. It isn't, but with this trait, it is included. That function is included into a model. And if we can test it, we go to form, I don't know, product, some kind of price. And if we go to our Laravel log, indeed we have that file name test to upload. So this works well. And if we want to reuse that in a user model, we just do the same thing. We add a trait photoable, also add a trait photoable here to use, and then in user controller we can do the same thing. So store, user upload file, we can specify a different file, for example, and if we go to user management and store something, we will test it, submit, and see if it works. So new user entered, and if we go to Laravel log, file name user.png to upload, which is exactly the parameter that we are passing. In more complicated scenario in real life, probably that upload file will be much more complicated, but you get the point. So you have a trait as a separate set of functions, and you include that as a trait into any model you want. If you wish to have more examples of traits, Laravel is actually full of it. So if we go to default user model, if you use soft deletes, guess what? It's a trait. So soft deletes is a behavior that you can inject into any Eloquent model. If you want to have notifications, for example, Laravel notifications, and then do user notify, it's notifiable, and notifiable is a trait, and it uses even more things trait inside of trait, so it's even multi-layer. So Laravel is full of traits, and also if you use packages, the most common example is Spotty Laravel Media Library. It also has a trait. I think I have that opened. Yep, Media Library documentation. To prepare your model, you need to implement some interface, and it also has a trait. So traits are usually the functions that don't belong anywhere else inside of interface or inside of some class in object-oriented hierarchy, but it could be reusable in existing classes, usually in Eloquent models. In this lesson, we're going to talk about dependency injection. And this is a pretty popular but more advanced topic in PHP and in Laravel, and I will try to explain it with example. First, a general dependency injection with services, how it would work in PHP, not only in Laravel. And then in the second part of the lesson, I will show you Laravel's kind of magic called container and how it resolves dependencies. So let's start with an example of Google Maps. Let's say we have a class called GeoService that takes care of anything related to geographical stuff, like coordinates, like resolving coordinates from address, maybe some more logic, and underneath it uses Google Maps service. So another service, another class, which actually takes care of the details. So GeoService is for more kind of top level stuff, so what to do with coordinates, with maps, and with latitude and longitude. And Google Maps service actually implements it, gets the call to Google Maps, and does all the trick. And in the controller, in our general Laravel controller, we just create GeoService and call process address from the request. Sounds really simple. Now, what if we want to change Google Maps into something else? Into, for example, OpenStreetMaps, especially with last year's 2018, Google Maps changed their logic, their pricing, and it's not free anymore. Well, up until some level. So it's pretty often to change to OpenStreetMap. So for that, you probably need to create OpenStreetMap service, which would do something similar. So both classes are placed in app services folder with namespace app services, and you want to change Google Maps to OpenStreetMaps. Probably then, in this case, in GeoService, you need to replace Google Maps service to OpenStreetMap service. And that is pretty inconvenient because what you would do, what you want to do is, as a developer, is just control stuff, call stuff from the controller. So you want here, you want the choice to be here in controller instead of somewhere deep in the service. So that's where dependency injection comes in. You can actually inject the class that will actually be a parameter of that service. To do that, we create private variable called maps service, which can be any service, Google Maps, OpenStreetMaps, whatever else in the future. And we do injection via construct method. There are a few types of dependency injection, but the most popular by far is construct via construct. So not private, public function construct. And then you pass the parameter of map service and assign that to that private variable. And then whatever you need, you don't create the service inside of that function, you just call the private property like this. And then what it does, you can call GeoService from the controller, passing the parameter of Google Maps. Actually, you can create Google Maps service, for example. Service equals new Google Maps service, and then pass it as a parameter. So that's it. This way we inject the object of that class, and then we don't really care in this service which Google Maps or OpenStreetMaps is a provider. We pass it from the controller via construct method. So this is a simple example of dependency injection. Now in Laravel, on top of that, there are a few things that help with dependency injection. It's kind of a related, but not the same topic, but it's really related. Look at this one. For example, request and parameter request. You don't resolve it anywhere. You just pass it as a parameter, but it works by magic. This is Laravel magic called container, and container resolves the dependencies for methods. For construct or for other methods, it's basically doing the same thing, so you don't need to pass the request. It's basically doing the same thing as you would do new request, this one, and then you can use that request. So that's why in Laravel you probably will see a lot of type hinting parameters, and then Laravel would know that it should be an object of request. Or if you have like requests, I have store, for example, store permissions request, then Laravel would know that this parameter should be an object of this specific class type. Basically, that's all you need to know about dependency injection on the surface, how it works in Laravel. Of course, you could dive deeper and read more about service container, how it actually works under the hood, how to bind it to interface. But that's not the topic of this course. I just wanted to give you an overview, a simple example of dependency injection. So I hope you could use it in your projects. The main goal and the main purpose of dependency injection is the case where you want to change some implementation to another. In this case, it's Google Maps to OpenStreetMaps. It may be a database connection to some other database connection. It may be mailing class, so you want to use Drip instead of MailChimp, something like that. So usually it's external classes that you want to interchange. So in this case, dependency injection helps you. In this lesson, I'm going to talk about design patterns in Laravel. And I was thinking about that lesson a lot from different angles, how to explain that, all those fancy words like strategy, provider, adapter, factory, and all of those various design patterns. And I've watched a few videos to recap my mind, and I concluded that I cannot possibly explain that in this 5 to 10 minute video, all the design patterns. And on top of that, I realized that you don't really even need those design patterns in basic Laravel projects, in simple Laravel project. Why is that? Because Laravel takes care about everything for you. Laravel internally uses those design patterns, the framework, so you wouldn't need to really care about them. Because it's pretty complex theory. So in this case, for example, I've watched a wonderful talk by Bobby Bauman at Laracon EU 2017, but still in the presentation it's so much theory. So like, what is a manager pattern? Builds complex objects step by step, return different object based on data. Like, it's not practical, it's not usable in real life. And of course he has more examples like building pizza, building objects, but it's really hard to transform into your real world, your real projects, how to build those classes and build those objects, whether it should be factory or strategy or something else. Then I started reading also great resource design patterns for humans, and even here the list of design patterns is pretty extensive, so it's like 20 patterns or so. Simple factory, for example, how to create the objects. And the thing is, you don't need to know how those patterns work or how are they called. You just need to know what you really need to know is object-oriented programming. So how to create objects, how to pass the parameters, what is the dependency injection that we discussed before, and some design patterns you will probably use. You will use factories while creating objects for testing. You will use provider while looking at your service provider sometimes. But it's all documented in Laravel documentation, so how to use factories for testing. Or for example, if you want to change, let's look at the code. for example, in providers, in route service provider, where do you change the API prefix or middleware or file name? It's all documented in the documentation of official Laravel, and you don't really need to know how that design pattern works and what that provider actually does and what is a service provider at all. You just need to learn to use it. What I did like better, I found a talk which isn't even named the design pattern or anything. It's just named really weirdly, because that's why it didn't appear even on the search in Google or on YouTube. It's a talk by Matt Stauffer at Laracon 2018. That's what I really love, patterns that pay off. And he's talking about those design patterns in a way without even mentioning the structure and the internals of how those work. Just giving the examples, why you need to do, like what to do with env file, for example, how to use, he calls it popos, service classes, it's like simple PHP object or something like that. So he encourages in his talk to not overcomplicate things, and you will probably need design patterns as soon as you start to create something really complex like Laravel. For example, Taylor needs those patterns a lot because the whole Laravel is built on those design patterns. It's a mix of those patterns, but if you're creating projects on top of Laravel as a framework, it's pretty good to know the patterns, but you don't really have to. So in this course, I decided to skip all the theory behind design patterns at all. I did touch, and I will touch some of them in separate lessons. So we've discussed already services, repositories. We will talk about testing. But in general, I wouldn't advise to dive deep into those design pattern theory, at least for now. But if you grow with the projects, maybe you will need it somewhere. So it's kind of a weird lesson here, weird maybe rant on design patterns. In my experience, I didn't need them much, but the things that I did need and I did adapt into practice, those I did mention in the course, and I will mention it even further. In this video, we will talk about unit testing, or testing in general, automated testing in Laravel, and what can we do to make it easier in terms of code structure. So the course is called How to Structure Laravel Project in Laravel Code, and what we can do to make it easier. And I have two tips for you. Here I have an example of feature user test, which is kind of a fictional example. You create a new user, and then you have API call for user show method, and then you assert that the status is 200 and that user is the same user. And API call is here, just a simple user show within resource controller, so nothing fancy here. And if you can see here, so my tip number one is to use factories. Not only because of unit testing, but even if you don't do unit test, it will help to seed your data, some dummy data. So in this example, I have three database tables, 3 models, user, post, and comment. Simple block, so user write posts, and posts may have comments. And for that, I've created database factory. User factory is from Laravel default. I didn't change that, and that comes as an example for you as a factory. So then you can just file save as into whatever you want, and then you can create more factories. So for post, I've defined a factory of 2 fields, so random user out of 10. I assume that it will be 10 users in the database. It's kind of risky, so you can change that to another logic. So just fake post, and then fake comment with 1 out of 50 post. And then in the seeder, I can use those factories and create as many user posts and comments as I want. But those factories can be reused and really conveniently in tests. So if we come back to our user test, what I'm doing is I'm creating a user, and then I'm doing a show here. And if we go to our PHP unit here, No errors here for sessions because I have more tests to show you, but I wanted to show you that this doesn't have any errors. If we show, for example, to demo that it may error, I just run PHP unit again, and this should fail. Status received 404 because find or fail returned 404 code. So even this failed. It's not even returning JSON. Right, so this test works, and my tip number one, as I repeat, is use factories, because it will help you to mock the data to create something fake, with Faker, of course. And then another tip is for more unit testing. So this was more of a feature test, so get that JSON, get that URL, and see what the data is. And for unit test, I have an example of comments. Let's say we have comments for users, and then may be approved or not approved. And you want to have a test of if you create a new user, they don't have unapproved comments. And then you want to test that there is one unapproved comment if you create one. So in this case, again, I'm using factories. So factory for user, factory for one post and adding a user, and then factory for one comment, which is approved 0. And I have a comment service with a function to check unapproved comments by user. Now, this is the result that I've done, and you can structure it differently. You can skip that construct, you can fill that data not inside of the test, but somewhere else. That's totally up to you. What I wanted to show here is in the service. So for example, if you have a service for comments, for various calculations, checks, and various logic, structure that class to be testable. So if you have only method, for example, count unapproved comments for all users, and you, for example, you return array of every user has this amount of comment, this method is not really testable. Well, it is testable, but then it returns all of the data with huge amount. Okay, so instead of doing this, you should probably have a method for one particular user and do this. So this count by user ID. And then this small amount of calculation for one particular user is perfectly testable, or more conveniently testable, because you can fake a user, fake a comment, and then make your test, make your assertion. So what I'm saying here is my tip number 2 is whatever you have in your service classes, maybe use repositories, maybe use libraries, whatever, please make those functions as small as possible so you would be able to call them from your tests and test specifically that function.